My name is Sarah Katz. I want to welcome everyone tonight for this really important panel discussion. I'm a member of the Freelance Solidarity Project Steering Committee within the National Writers Union. The Freelance Solidarity Project's mission is to improve the lives of freelance digital media workers through advocacy, legislation, education, and strengthening our work in the labor movement. The National Writers Union promotes and protects the interests of writers, journalists, podcasters, book authors, translators, and other varying media workers. We are a labor union that's recognized by the National Labor Relations Board, and we're very largely volunteer run. So I want to thank all of our volunteers here tonight and all the volunteers who have helped put in a lot of time and effort in supporting this event. I also want to thank our very many sponsors and partners who I'll shout out at the end of the event, but we wouldn't have been able to do this without so much outreach support. This is a very well attended event, so please bear with us if you encounter any tech glitches, and please also feel free to put your questions in the chat. This will be interactive once we go through a series of questions in the beginning. So we are excited to present Big Media and the Rise of Authoritarianism, How We Fight Back. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's event moderator. Morgan Harper is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the American Economic Liberties Project, a nonpartisan research and advocacy organization seeking to break up monopolies. Previously, Morgan was a senior advisor to the first director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in Washington, D.C. Morgan is based in Columbus, Ohio. Thank you so much, Morgan. We're really thrilled to have you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and everyone for joining. I'm really honored to be able to moderate this conversation. And, so at American Economic Liberties Project, we've spent a lot of time since our founding trying to bring attention to the dangers of consolidation across the economy. It used to be an educational exercise. That has changed quite a bit over the last couple of years, especially when we're talking about media and the impacts on a lot of the industries that our experts that I'll be joined by on today's panel are able to discuss that you all, I'm sure many of you on the call work in and are starting already to feel a lot of the effects of or are concerned about some of the pending potential effects to come. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panel. We have a really great mix of folks that, again, working in industry, academic experts who have studied this. But like Sarah said, we do want this to be interactive. So after we run through some questions that we've prepared, very much want to get to some of the questions that were already submitted before tonight, and then we'll be able to handle some that come up through the chat. So please feel free to submit your questions. So I'll run through, again, very brief intros of all of our panelists because they all have such great backgrounds. It could go on forever, but just to give you a sense of who's going to be on and who you'll be hearing from. First, we'll have Matt Pierce, who's the Director of Policy for Rebuild Local News, a national nonprofit coalition that develops and supports effective public policies to support community news and information. He was previously president and co-founder of Media Guild of the West and a staff writer for the Los Angeles Times. Thanks, Matt, for joining us. We also have Great. We also have Jax DeLuca, who is a cultural strategist with over 2 decades of experience working across public service and nonprofit arts organizations. Currently, she's the executive director at the Future Film Coalition, partner of American Economic Liberties Project. That we love everyone who's on the panel, but we especially love people who are on the coalitions are a part of. And it's a newly formed national alliance advocating for stronger protections for the independent film sector. And she's currently a research fellow at the Shorenstein Center of Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. We also have Tony Pisanovsky as the president of International Publishers, one of the oldest and longest continually publishing left, labor, and Marxist book publishers in the US. Tony's a former union and community organizer. He is also the author of The Cancer of Colonialism, W. Alpheus Hunton, Black Liberation and the Daily Worker, 1944 to 1946. Tony, you're really testing me with your bio there. I had to get through that whole title, but that's okay. We'll discuss that later. And then we also have Dan Sinekin, who is the Winship Distinguished Research Professor of English at Emory University and the author of Big Fiction, How Conglomeration Changed the Publishing Industry and American Literature. And last but not least, Victor Picard, who's a professor of media policy and political economy at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication, where he co-directs the Media Inequality and Change Center. He has also authored several books on the history and politics of media, including America's Battle for Media Democracy and Democracy Without Journalism? Question mark? Yes. Okay, great. And so with that, I will actually turn it over to Dr. Picard to talk through a little bit of like level setting about this correlation between media consolidation and weakened democracy.
Excellent. Thank you, Morgan. Want to make sure everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so yeah, it's my pleasure to be able to kick things off. And first, I want to thank the organizers and thank everyone on this call for engaging with such a timely and important topic. Generally speaking, we know that big media mergers and media conglomerates are bad for everyone, except for those few who stand to gain financially. They're bad for media workers, bad for communities, they're bad for consumers, and they're bad for democracy writ large. And that's the part that I was asked to talk about. I think some of the other panelists will get more into the nitty gritty nuts and bolts about this particular merger and how it's hurting particular industries. But I'm just going to be going into some of the big picture analysis and just hit on a few key points about why and how media conglomerates and these big media mergers hurt democracy. It's straight out of Democratic Theory 101 that media diversity, and that's having diverse views and diverse voices, diverse stories in our media, require diverse media owners. And suffice it to say, we don't have that in the United States. United States, we have this hyper commercialized, corporate dominated media system that has never been well designed to serve democracy. Many sectors are dominated by a handful of corporations with only very light, if any, public interest obligations in place. We have only a very weak public media system in the United States. So under this kind of system, profit imperatives will almost always trump democracy, to use a terrible pun. So media diversity has really been disappearing throughout the US media landscape for many years now, not just with this current merger. And one of the reasons why this happens is just through sheer cost cutting. Even during the best of times, media corporations are often trying to maximize profits by ruthlessly cutting corners, trying to force their media workers to do more for less. Things that cost a lot of money, like high quality journalism, are often given short shrift. Meanwhile, content that can be easily replicated and cheaply produced, like having shouting heads on various screens to capture our attention, to deliver to advertisers, this kind of content gets amplified. So media conglomeration intensifies these commercial logics. Cost cutting becomes especially pronounced right after media mergers, when oftentimes these companies will take on tremendous amounts of debt. Paramount took on tens of billions, I believe it's $79 billion in debt. I need to be fact checked on that, but I think that's what's been reported. So in order to service that debt, they're almost certainly going to cut a lot of jobs. These costs also get passed on to consumers. As they raise prices, they offer lower quality, less creative programming. So to give one of the more obvious examples, when media conglomerates merge, they often merge newsrooms or they cut journalists altogether. And instead rely more on commentary, perhaps. And we've been seeing this happen with CBS. It would likely happen to CNN as well if this merger does go through. And studies have shown that, generally speaking, media conglomerates lead to less local news, more advertising, and shift towards conservative political commentary. This is especially true when we're talking about companies like Sinclair Broadcasting, for example. So degrading the quality of our news and our entertainment media is bad enough, but media conglomeration also creates these private tyrannies whereby oligarchs command vast swaths of our media with numerous perverse incentives. It allows them to shape much of what we hear, see, and read in our media, what stories get told, how important issues get framed. It's also dangerous in conferring such political economic power, whether it's through lobbying or campaign donations or offering preferential coverage of particular politicians. These media oligarchs almost always develop corrupt relationships with those in power. And we saw this under Viktor Orban in Hungary. We've seen this with the Murdochs, Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, the Ellisons, and many others. We know that billionaires will almost always weaponize their media assets to deploy them toward their own class interests. So in the final analysis, the biggest concern here is simply about concentrated power, concentrated media power in our democratic society. And even if these media owners had the hearts of angels, it's still far too much power for individuals to have over our media in democracy, especially when it's so easy now for them to acquire media assets. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post in 2013 for less than half of what he would pay for his super yacht. So we've all seen those bumper stickers that every billionaire is a policy failure, and similarly, every billionaire-owned media outlet is also a policy failure. And this really drives home, and something I'll return to later, I'm sure, that much of what we're dealing with today is the direct result of policy choices, political decisions. None of this was inevitable. It wasn't natural, nor must it be permanent. Thank you.
Great. The excellent level setting remarks to kind of frame up the discussion. And I'm just going to underscore a couple of things before we jump into the discussion with the panelists. I mean, one, that you're kind of disabusing the sense of efficiency. I mean, we probably don't have to tell this audience that's kind of hogwash. We saw a whole movement in the last federal presidential administration under Biden, where there was this shift in enforcers that were leading the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, that were starting to have a more comprehensive view of what the standard should be for whether a merger goes through, and kind of like pushing back on this idea that price alone, saving money, is going to lead to efficiency. One, that doesn't always happen in mergers, like you said. Two, if it is, it's often through cost cutting that has other effects, like on workers, and not to mention the quality of the content or whatever the product is at hand that starts to go down. So I think we all know, a lot of the mergers we're focused on right now in the media space: Paramount, Warner Brothers, Nexstar, Tegna. You mentioned Sinclair in the broadcasting area as well. But that's something for us all to make sure that we have as a talking point, that this idea that they're leading to more efficiency, it just doesn't hold up. And that's not really the standard for merger review. The other thing I want to underscore is your connection to corruption. That's something at American Economic Liberties Project we're spending a lot of time right now to focus people on. And it started early in this administration with some of the merger reviews that were happening, not one in the media space, but just to give people the context. Another transaction, HP Juniper, starting to see the role of lobbyists that were getting meetings with the White House. I'm going to keep that line of hearts of gold with billionaires that are running these media companies. I don't think that seems to be the case with Larry Ellison, David Ellison in the mix for the Paramount Warner Brothers deal, but certainly we are starting to see those signs of corruption, and that's something for us all to continue to highlight as we bring attention to the dangers of this merger. Great. So Matt, another longtime partner of American Economic Liberties Project, I'm going to turn it to you first, though. Again, this is going to be one where we'll hear from a few panelists to just describe, from your perspective, a pivotal moment in this issue of media consolidation when you really started to think that and see or feel that things were changing in your industry.
That's a great question. And I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much to the Freelance Solidarity Project for hosting this event. Morgan, with the American Economic Liberties Centers, they're great champions on this call who have been working on all of these issues for many years. I mean, for me, I was hired as a staff writer at the Los Angeles Times in 2012. I was hired when the company was in bankruptcy. It had been once a great family-owned newspaper that was just an absolute Pulitzer factory, did a lot of journalism. It was also an imperfect institution, but by the time that I had arrived there, it had been hollowed out through consolidation into a chain. We would soon be operated by a private equity firm called Tronc, which had some really terrible ideas for what our journalism would look like. And we ended up in the hands of a billionaire, Patrick Soon-Shiong, who ended up spending a lot of money on our newsroom and hiring a bunch of journalists. And, we did a lot of great work, and again, won more prizes. And again, we're an imperfect institution. But the thing that really struck me over the course of my career as a journalist, and as one of those journalists who was part of the digital revolution inside of our organization, bringing journalism to people over social media. I had started there writing derivative blogs just to get Google News hits, because that's how we reach traffic. What I watched over the course of my career there through all these different types of ownership structures was, in the end, a repeated failure by all of these different types of ownership, which were concentrated forms of ownership of their own kind by very powerful people or institutions, was that all of that was being dwarfed by what is, to me, the single most powerful media monopoly of all, which is Google. These incredibly massive tech firms that control everything from how audiences would be delivered to our work, to how the advertising for that work was monetized, even the data sometimes that you get from your journalism to tell to tell you what people wanted would be filtered through these really huge tech companies. And toward the end of my career, when we were owned by another one of those quote unquote benevolent billionaires, I had the experience of watching massive amounts of investment coming into the newsroom, which ultimately was money that got lit on fire because I was just watching our journalism getting strangled and strangled and strangled and unable to reach the public that we were trying to serve. And ultimately, it ended in mass layoffs. Our billionaire owner was subsidizing the newsroom to the tunes of tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, which was spent on local journalism, and ultimately ended in an enormous amount of heartbreak. And so that's why, as a unionized journalist, proudly unionized the LA Times, formed a News Guild Local, unionized many other journalists. We took our worker power and tried to turn it into legislative power to try to go and get back some of the value that had been stolen from us by what is now this tech monopoly with a $4 trillion market cap, which is something that is so much vaster than we could ever even comprehend a normal, even media monopoly in the local news space having. So we didn't win, we lost, we got crushed. So the struggle continues, but it really was the failure of innovation to come and save us that was one of the defining stories of my career, and which told me that there were greater market forces and legal forces at play.
And Matt, just one quick follow-up, if I may. So, if I'm understanding correctly, you kind of had some hope that perhaps this would work out, or maybe there was going to be some innovation that would be coming from new ownership or new investment to an extent. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, I mean, we watched, dozens and dozens and dozens of journalists get hired. We watched a huge amount of investment into journalism that was not technically profit maximizing, and it was a disaster. And I think one of the things that I really look back on from the 2010s period of media, which some of the folks from the media space on this call may remember, is that it was a time of tremendous innovation and people trying different forms of media and different formats for news and different ways to reach people. And ultimately, one of the things that was consistent across the board for all these different types of media is that we are all trapped in the same business, and that was the business of being online. And that was just controlled by a tiny number of companies. And it ultimately determined the fate of who got to work and who got laid off.
Great. Thank you for sharing that perspective from the journalism side of things. And so, Tony, curious from the publisher angle, what your experience has been, if there is a moment that you could pinpoint about where you really felt like things were changing, kind of like building off of what Matt said, not really able to like work within the system as it was designed. Curious your thoughts.
Well, I kind of come to this question more so as a historian and less as a publisher. Um, in fact, I actually want to tell a story to answer this question. And I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, Everybody here has heard of W.E.B. Du Bois, I hope anyways. One of the most revered and influential African Americans in U.S. history, a founder of the NAACP, a champion of equality, advocate for peace, Pan-African internationalist, etc. So in the late 1940s, as the Cold War was heating up, as the NAACP revoked Du Bois's membership, as the House Un-American Activities Committee labeled Du Bois a foreign agent, and as the State Department revoked his passport, something else also happened. Simultaneously, almost every publisher in the country refused to publish his books. Um, Mind you, this was someone who did not want for publishers. He had been publishing for decades, Black Reconstruction, The Souls of Black Folk, etc. His politics didn't change. The publishing environment changed. In short, the publishers acquiesced to the emerging Cold War anti-communist consensus, and Du Bois became unpublishable. And it was at this time that Du Bois started a long and fruitful relationship with my publisher, International Publishers. We had already been labeled subversives, and so this wasn't a big deal to us. So while I can't say this was a pivotal turning point for media consolidation, I can say it was a major turning point historically, at least for me, in how I look at how media consolidation and publisher consolidation affects how I think about the publishing industry and why we must have independent publishers and independent media. And so I hope that at least adds a little nuance to this discussion and how we think about things historically and how history influences the present.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Yeah, we don't have to care whether they have hearts of gold if we have a lot of competition and different options, and they don't have so much power. So yeah, totally hear that and appreciate the Du Bois example. Dan, I'll turn to you. Kind of same question, getting everybody a chance to give us their background from your perspective on what were some of the inflection points from your perspective on the media consolidation issue.
Yeah, so I'll pick up where Tony left off. I'm a scholar who studies the history of publishing in the US in the 20th and 21st centuries. Around that Cold War era in the 40s and 50s was when publishing started to move slowly toward consolidation. In the 60s, it started to pick up, and it really started to pick up in the late 1970s. It got intense enough in the late 1970s that at that point, a number of authors got together. They held a press conference through the Authors Guild and asked for antitrust legislation to break up the big publishers 50 years ago. So this is something that's been going on for a long time. They even got an audience in front of a subcommittee of the US Senate just months before Ronald Reagan was elected. And of course, rather than going in the direction of antitrust, things just became easier to consolidate. So kind of ongoing then through the decades, consolidation continued until in the early 21st century, we had the big six in publishing. And in 2013, when Penguin and Random House merged to get Penguin Random House, that was the largest publisher in the world, brought us the big five. And we are still sitting at the big five today. One of the big changes in the last few years has been the introduction of private equity into the field of of book publishing. This is relatively novel in this field. There's a great book by the scholar Andrew DeWard about how private equity has infiltrated film and TV since 2008 in the financial crisis, and that he traces a line through private equity entering film and TV and us getting just pure IP slop in the film industry. So seeing private equity, which intensifies like big bulky conglomerates actually make a little bit more space for some weird shit to happen in the areas of culture in the world of publishing, where books are so relatively cheap to produce compared to a lot of other media forms. Private equity really intensifies the profit, bottom line, profit oriented movement. So KKR, the world's largest private equity firm, bought Simon and Schuster, one of the big five publishing companies. And there's been a few other experiments in the last few years of private equity getting into different publishing firms. So this is one thing to really pay attention to. The good news that I can bring is that the rise of consolidation in publishing in the late 70s and 80s created the inspiration for nonprofit publishing. So before then, nonprofits kind of had been growing in the post-war years in symphony and opera and theater especially, but not in publishing. But in the 80s, nonprofits began to grow in publishing, and now we have a robust If small compared to the big five, nevertheless robust, exciting place where aesthetic and political risk still thrive. Because what happens with the consolidation in the big five is that it's ever decreasing the amount of aesthetic and political risk that book publishers are willing to take.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And yeah, that makes sense and kind of, like you said, does build off of a lot of the points that Tony was making as well. So appreciate that. Jax, and turning to film, and I know you wear several hats, but curious, yeah, from your perspective, some of the notes that you had mentioned historically. And I see we're preempting a question that was in the audience as well about some of the historical context that might help people understand a little bit of what's happening now. Turn it to you.
Yes. So actually in the resources, I put in a link that Matt Stoller,
I've heard of him.
Yeah.
He works with me.
You might be familiar. But Matt wrote a really comprehensive blog post around, it was about how Hollywood has been rediscovering its anti-monopoly roots. And so I feel like that's a good primer for anyone who's really looking backwards to like what was happening, kind of even going back to the early 1900s and kind of the basis for some of the anti-monopoly laws in relationship to this the film industry. But I'll talk from my experience. I started at the National Endowment for the Arts around 2015. And at that point, that was still kind of this golden era for documentary film, independent film, where there were still late night bidding wars for independent films at Sundance, which is always a good sign. But in the past few years, that really declined. And this was very much due to the strength of the digital disruption, very similar to what we saw happen with music. And so I feel like between that experience and just seeing how independent voices were repeatedly kind of getting pushed out of a system because they didn't have access to enough capital and they couldn't compete because they didn't have enough marketing dollars to compete in a system against some of the big streamers. It also would affect kind of the back end financial recoupment opportunities. And in the end, that really just destroys the ability for people who are working in that field independently that are not backed by studios or working within a franchise. It makes it really hard for them to have their film kind of come up in the pipeline because it's very, very fragmented. And so at the same time, in my role at the NEA as the Film and Media Arts Director, which I'm no longer at, we also worked with people in the broadcast realm and people who worked in public media and people who worked in independent journalism. And so that's a lot of public stations who also saw a decline in support for developing their own independent content. So it was very clear to me how increasingly reliant that independent work was on getting financing from private sources and from public sources, but also in very like non-reliable ways. And so I think between all of that, just looking now at stepping back in a bigger picture, one of the things I've been working on through my fellowship at the Shorenstein Center is thinking about how all of these shared structural pressures between independent journalism and what you've all mentioned for publishing and local media, local journalism, independent film, independent music. It's all facing a lot of the similar structures from these monopolies. And so it's really exciting to have this conversation and really talk to you all about those similarities and thinking about how we can gain control back in that. One of the books recently that I have been reading is called Ghosting the News. And it's by Margaret Sullivan, who actually was a former editor for Buffalo News. And it's so interesting to read the story of local journalism and the crisis of American democracy and really seeing how that applies to filmmakers and how stories are getting pushed out of the mainstream because there's a lot of conflicts of carrying certain things. And the story that Dan, you were just mentioning, or Tony, about earlier was something I was thinking about earlier with the film called Union. And Union is a film that's about the Amazon workers unionizing. And people have not been able to get that film distributed And it's very much for the same reasons because people fear without, taking on that film and distributing it because they don't want to anger Amazon services, which many people rely on as well. So um, that was a long and winding answer.
No, love it. And I'm just going to very quickly, Victor, if there's anything else you would add from a historical perspective, having heard from all the panelists before we pivot into some of the impacts on workers and democracy and just bringing that home.
Yeah, very quickly, because I love geeking out on the media history, and I try to do a fair amount of that work on my own. And one inflection point I would draw people's attention to is something that happened in the 1930s and into the 40s when we were first designing our broadcast media system in the US, and we went down a very different path compared to almost every other democracy on the planet, whereby we decided to privatize and commercialize our public airwaves instead of establishing a strong public media system. We basically handed it over to two major corporations, NBC and CBS. We later broke up NBC into two. That's how we got ABC, but going from two big players to three did not transform the media landscape. We tried to enforce all these different public interest regulations like the Fairness Doctrine. I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with that. That was established in 1949. That got thrown out in 1987 during the Reagan administration. So we've just had this constant struggle, and you really could trace back to, I would think of as an original sin, where we decided to create such a hyper-capitalistic media system in the US. And we eventually created a public media system in the late 60s, but we always impoverished it. I can get into the details later about how much of a global outlier the US public media system is compared to every other democracy on the planet. Of course, we've phased out what paltry amount of support we gave them last year in the rescission package. So long-winded way of saying that the US media system is fairly exceptional compared to most media systems around the world, especially in democratic societies. And I think that's something that we really have to grapple with when we're thinking about like what kind of alternative system can we create out of this mess.
Great. Thanks. And so now I want to come back, and actually I'm going to go to you, Matt, from your experience of having actually unionized. And and I think we've heard already from these opening comments about, this is about people kind of coming together and willing to fight back. And so, if you could share a little bit about like the impacts of consolidation on workers and some of that experience of just like building solidarity and your efforts with the guild.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, every single problem that local media could possibly have, we have right now. And I think the sad reality of part of that trauma is that workers' concerns are constantly and always the last to be taken into consideration. And you talk to journalists everywhere, and this is their experience. And so, we were tired of being exploited. And first it was, some Wall Street idiots. Later, it was by a billionaire in his own way. But we built our union from the ground up at the LA Times. We had secret meetings. We would put fake events on our calendars for like a book club, or we're going out for carnitas, but we were actually meeting off-site away from the newsroom to scheme with each other about how we were going to take shit over. And it was really great. And I have to say that, I imagine that many of you have gone through the experience of unionization if you're in the media sector over the news media sector over the past 10 or 15 years. But there was a tremendous wave that happened. And we got to be a part of that. And the culture of solidarity that got to be built in so many different newsrooms was really special. And it's something that the average worker in the US does not get to experience anymore, which is the workplace is something other than just this location of like you go to your job and you put in your work and you collect your check and go home. And instead, it can be a place where people look out for each other. They help improve each other's work and the working conditions, and you feel a real sense of pride about the work that you're doing because you know that you're in it with people together and who are also having your back. I firmly believe from going from just a rank and file reporter and a journalist at the LA Times who was working on these issues inside of my own company to somebody who is helping journalists unionize in all sorts of newsrooms. I ended up getting this kind of special bird's eye view of our industry, commercial and nonprofit, We unionized journalists at hedge fund newsrooms, publicly traded companies, billionaires. We had small digital newsrooms. We had nonprofit newsrooms. And and unfortunately, one of the realities is that working conditions in all sorts of places were kind of bad. There actually wasn't problems contained to one type of newsroom, and that was the reality. But having gone through that experience, having lived it, having helped people organize and bargain for contracts and take strike authorization votes and go out on strike, and seeing people win, in some cases, life-changing raises, or at least decent raises that showed some respect for the work that they were putting in, was incredibly impactful. And it was, to me, the only meaningful intervention that these journalists have experienced in this industry that immeasurably improved their lives and gave them more power, more of a voice, more of a control, including over how AI is now getting introduced in their workplaces, which is a whole new side of confrontation. Allowed them to have a voice in the political process. And one of the things that's really challenging about it is that so many people have now been forced out of their jobs. Some people are not freelancers by choice. They've been forced to become freelancers. They've been forced to go independent, not by choice, but because they economically had to. This ability to organize really powerful unions has been impacted, and that's why I think freelance journalists should join organizations like the Freelance Solidarity Project and the National Writers Union and make these organizations really strong, so that workers have a voice everywhere, that they're struggling with how much they're getting paid, how they're getting treated, and how they're fighting with AI, because it is a fight. And so, to a certain level, policy plays a big role in that, but ultimately the fight does start with the workers.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And I'm glad you mentioned AI. I don't think we're going to have time to spend a ton of time on that topic today, but knowing that, that unionization solidarity in the face of these technologies, we don't just have to take it, kind of work to fight back and get real results. So appreciate that. Tony, so I'm going to kind of combine a couple questions for you. I'm curious in any additional thoughts you have on harm to worker, but then also just making that connection. And, you alluded to a little bit in your earlier remarks, but on the impact on democracy from media consolidation and your thoughts there.
Well, I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of Matt, if that's okay.
Sure.
You know, for many of us, what we do in our unions, it's really the only place where we experience authentic, real life democracy. I'm, oh, my, sorry, I'm having some weather issues. I'll stay on for as long as I can. Uh, I'm 48 years old. I grew up in a union household. My father and grandfather both worked at the Chrysler plant outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And so I grew up in a union household. I remember as a small child sitting on my grandfather's lap where he would read to me Solidarity magazine, which was the magazine of the United Auto Workers Union. But I'm the last of some of a generation that grew up in a union household. A lot of people don't know what it means to grow up in a union household. They don't know what it means to sit around the table when your parents or your grandparents are discussing union contracts, or when they walk the picket line, or you don't experience that firsthand. And a lot of people don't experience organization, period, at all, much less union organization. And so I think we've got to really get back to what that means to experience democracy in the workplace. And when I mean organization, I also mean community organization. I mean church groups, or even the bowling league, or whatever the case may be. We don't really understand organization in that sense anymore. And so how do we get back to real democracy if we're not experiencing democracy in our workplace, where we spend such a high percentage of our lives, or in our church or the bowling league or whatever? And I apologize, but I'm going to have to get off. So
No worries. I'm going to pass it to Dan. All right,
okay,
Dan, you're
thank you.
tapped in. Finish Tony's thoughts, read his mind, and give us your thoughts on just impact on democracy. Would be curious.
Yeah, no, I can't follow up on Tony. But I will say that what media consolidation is done in publishing to workers has meant that there are just a few companies that control most of publishing. They're in New York City, and because there's not a lot of competition between them, it has meant that the system of who gets to work at those publishing companies is just it's extremely narrow, difficult path with extremely far-reaching consequences for the books that are published in this country. So, publishing is an apprenticeship business. People start at the bottom. They start as interns, as editorial assistants, then assistant editors, and they work their way up over the years. And you're talking about $45,000 starting salary in New York City. And so a lot of people are just simply priced out of being able to work in publishing from the first place. And most of the people who get those jobs are people who are able to get into a school in New York, like NYU or Columbia, is where a lot of these young folks are coming from to get to work there. And so what it means is that you've got extremely narrow demographics, um, like highly concentrated in the people who are deciding which books are going to be the big books in this country. And there's a colleague of mine who's got a book coming out tomorrow, Laura McGrath's, called Middlemen. It's a great book about how publishing works right now. And what she points out at one point in that book is the consequences of this problem for who gets to work in publishing is that it's really registers for this demographic to like have a story about people in Cape Cod, but in much of the other parts of the country, they don't see the worth of it. So you're going to get a lot more stories about like people wanting to start a coffee shop on the Maine shore or something, just because that's the kind of thing that the demographic of people who get to work in New York are familiar with. That's part of their world. That's registers with them. They want to publish it. And so many other stories that are the publishing industry could tell. The part of the publishing industry that has the most power to get those books, the marketing backing to get in Reese's Book Club or on Oprah or win a big prize. They're part of a very tiny number, or like kind of demographic of people who are not a democratic representation of most of the country.
I was only laughing a little bit while you were going through that, Dan, because those Nantucket books have taken Ohio by storm. And I'm just like, folks, what are we doing? We got a lot of interesting stories right here. But anyway, that's a conversation for another day. But totally follow what you're saying. So I'm just going to open up actually very quickly to all the panels before we go to Jax to kind of break down some organizing happening on this specific Paramount transaction. Any other thoughts from others on the panel about this democracy connection? Victor, I'm looking at you. Matt, anything else?
Unions
I'll
are good
just
for democracy.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just very quickly double down on a couple things that have already been said, but just the devastation of local journalism in particular. I mean, according to the latest Medill report, we've lost 40% of our local newspapers, 75% of our local newspaper journalists. And I also want to lift up a report or a study that Matt's organization, Rebuild Local News, along with Muckrack, has put out this local journalist index, which shows that in the early 2000s, we had 40 journalists per 100,000 people. We now have 8.2 journalists per 100,000 people.
Wow.
So this is just devastating. And actually survey data show that the vast majority of Americans have no idea about the severity of this structural journalism crisis. So we've got to do a lot of consciousness raising and really talk about alternatives to this failing commercial model.
Great. Okay, Jax, I'm glad your hand is up because you're exactly where I'm headed. So yeah, any thoughts that you have on the harms to workers' democracy, but then also I want to make sure we have time for you to talk through what's going on with the Block the Merger campaign. So I'll let you take it away.
Yes. Yeah, building on all of that, independent media is really part of our civic infrastructure. So everything that you've all been talking about really relates to the film industry as well. And a few things are coming to mind as we've been partnering with some amazing organizations who work on this. One of them is the International Documentary Association and Archival Producers Alliance, the Committee for First Amendment, and some people who are with the Democracy Defenders Fund. And one of the things that's really happening with Block the Merger is we're really realizing that all the organizing we've been doing right now is really going beyond this single merger of the Warner Brothers Paramount. We're really thinking about the work that we're doing as part of a structural intervention that's really at this intersection of media and small business and workers' rights and democracy, because without this type of intervention, the continued consolidation of media power can just further narrow the range of stories and voices and perspectives that are available to the public. So it's basically everything you've all been saying. But one of the really interesting things that have come out of this work came from the Archival Producers Alliance. And this is shocking to us in terms of how it relates to democracy and how stories are told. But with the Paramount and Warner Brothers Discovery acquisition, that would mean that two of the largest broadcast archives, both CNN and CBS, would be merged, and that would result in concentrated control over historical records and a historical broadcast archive that people use for documentary films and for telling future stories and also retelling our past in certain ways. And since these archives actually are privately owned and they don't need to allow people to license those works, there can be selective access and the denial of use, or also editorial influence over the way stories will be told and how our histories are reflected in future stories. So I think that also is something we need to be thinking about now, because it feels very small and invisible in writing. But when you think about the long-term impact that has on on future generations and just how we can shape our own narrative is really scary.
Great. Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, I had not heard that. And I think that's a really important point to make sure that folks are aware of. So we are going to go to audience questions. We have a lot of them. Like I said, people submitted many in advance of the discussion. So yay, registrants and attendees, y'all are on it. I am going to just pose them, and then unless the panel gets quiet, I won't force anyone in particular to talk, but let's see if we get reactions that way. So, and this is a really good one. Actually, I'm lying. I'm changing course. Sorry, guys. I'm going to go to Matt on this one first, because we have a question about, let's say you're in one of these media companies right now. How do you go about resisting the consolidation that's happening from the inside? What would be recommendations there?
So not to like sound like a broken record, but just unionize. I will say that it's extremely challenging to fight ownership transitions. Though weirdly, we ended up forcing our ownership to sell us when we unionized the LA Times, who were such a gigantic pain in the ass under Tronc, the private equity firm, that they ended up just deciding to dump us over a weekend to Patrick Soon-Shiong. So that was something that we helped create through the tremendous amount of pressure and visibility that we were raising to how bad things had gotten in our own institution. I will say that there's genuinely, Victor touched on this, there's a real understanding problem out there in the public for how bad things have gotten in media and local media specifically. Like the polling just shows that people think most of their local news organizations are doing well financially. So people are just like struggling to factually understand that there's an incredible crisis going on, that it shows up in all the data. The workers will talk about it, but there's genuinely a messaging problem. So yeah, if I had to be honest, like trying to block mergers from the inside can be challenging, especially in the local news sector, where a lot of what we're dealing with, they are very large companies, but frequently they don't meet the market definition of a monopoly, which means there's not like legal leverage to try to get involved in that fight. That said, the News Guild's been very active in trying to fight the Tegna merger, which is happening, a hedge fund taking over a lot of local TV stations. And so that one is happening more through the traditional regulatory antitrust review route. So part of this is being part of a fighting organization that is willing to take on fights and not shy away from them.
Great. Thank you for that, Matt. I'll take anyone else's thoughts on that, but also next question. We've talked a lot about the harms and how we got here. I'm curious from panelists about specifically what steps need to be taken to break up these media monopolies and oligarch stranglehold on the US democracy. So Dan, maybe we start with you and
I mean, so there, for better or worse, there was an attempt to consolidate the publishing industry further a few years ago when Penguin Random House attempted to buy Simon and Schuster, which brought the big five down to the big four. And it was the Department of Justice at the time sued to block it and won. And so there does seem to have been like some effect on raising like a federal government. I mean, it's not going to happen under Trump, but like under a Democratic government, there is potentially in publishing a sense that like we've reached enough consolidation that antitrust comes into effect. But the outcome of that was that rather than the big four, we got private equity owning Simon and Schuster, and that's maybe worse than had Penguin Random House consolidated with Simon and Schuster. And so, like, I often look to, from my role as an English professor, when I'm writing for the public or giving talks to things, I often look consumer ended and I'm like, just pay more attention to the fact of who's publishing the books you're buying and pay attention to small publishers, pay attention to nonprofit publishers. They're able to do exciting, interesting things that the other companies can't. So try them out. And I think there's a lot to be said for just trying to get people to shift their buying habits towards the small presses.
great. Uh, anybody else want to add anything? No pressure, but I want to make sure I'm not cutting off.
Yeah, I think this thing with the Penguin case, the Penguin Random House case is really significant in terms of thinking about monopsony power. And I just added in the analysis that was used for that publishing case. And when you look at that, it's really similar for what's happening now in the film industry. So I feel like there's still a way to narrow down the market and thinking about how there's buyer side harms that have ripple effects on the entire film and media supply chain. And so I think we've come really close to identifying those bottlenecks, and state AG offices and the federal DOJ are interested in talking to us. But the one thing that's really challenging is people are afraid to talk because they also are afraid of kind of getting blacklisted in the industry if they're found out for talking about this, which is also just a telling point of how challenging it is to fight back against a merger. But also seconding what Dan is mentioning is what happens if we actually do block the merger? Then what? And so I think that's when we as all of our respective industries really need to work together to have a coordinated pushback. So that way, maybe we have a broader case that maybe can span across multiple industries in the face of all of the privatization and all of the ways that our livelihoods are kind of being ripped away in different ways. Because what I'm also noticing is policymakers really do not understand what it's like when you work independent in these realms, because there's so many lobbyists who go in and they're talking about it from a large, big picture perspective. But many of those people have never actually worked in the field at like on the ground at the level of the people that we've been talking to or that you've all experienced. So this is why we really launched the Block the Merger campaign. And our goal is to really collect stories of how people are affected by consolidation and trying to pinpoint when the changes started happening. So that way we can show the cumulative effects of mergers and monopolies, because I feel hopeful that someday there could be a much larger case that we could work towards that could better protect, or so we can have better policy protections for those working independently in all of these industries that are just completely destroyed from the digital disruption and haven't really had policy protections. And it's always been a mystery why when we're doing economic analysis and worker analysis reports, it's very hard to track freelancers and contract workers who might not be working in a specific way. Just the way that our workplace has also evolved has made it really hard to get data to show how extractive and how hard it is for people to make a living when they're working inside these systems.
Great. And actually, a real quick one for you, Jax, that I think it would be helpful if you could also just talk a little bit about who's currently in the coalition so folks are aware of gaps and maybe additional organizing opportunities. We got a specific question on, has ACLU joined the fight? And so, yeah, if you could answer that and then give a little bit more color as to what the coalition looks like now.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in the coalition. ACLU is not one of them, so that's interesting. I would love to find ways to connect with that group. We've really been working with people in the democracy defenders realm, and we have a lot of grassroots organizers. But for us in the independent film industry, I would say working at this level is very new to this particular part of the field because there hasn't really been a service organization that protected them. So this is why Future Film Coalition kind of came together, and we're really a network of many businesses and organizations and other organizations and individuals and freelancers. But that's why I like working with AELP and Free Press and Democracy Defenders Fund has been so useful in helping us navigate this at the policy level because we are brand new. It's our first campaign. It's a big one, and we're tiny and we have a lot of work ahead of us. But we've gotten a lot of support and any connections from anybody on this call. If you're willing to get involved, please send me an email. And also,
Great.
I see that Dominic's on here too, and he's part of our organizing group with the International Documentary Association. So I just wanted to give a shout out to them because they support a lot of the independent documentary filmmakers and independent journalists.
Great. And I'll just underscore a couple of things you said, Jax. One, never underestimate the ability for people in Washington, D.C. to have no idea what's actually going on in the real world. That's been one of the tactics that we've taken as economic liberties is really try to play that role of connecting real people in industries with folks who are policymakers. Some of them are bought and sold and don't care about knowing what's going on. They only care what works for the big guys, but a lot of them just don't know and don't hear from alternative voices. So, what Jax is saying, so important to plug into these types of efforts so that your stories and voices are heard and then really can influence the narrative and policymaking process. But like Dan was saying, I mean, this is not the same environment that some of the mergers were being blocked in the prior administration. And so I'm glad that Jax mentioned the role of state attorneys general, really important right now to connect with them and make sure that they're also hearing these stories because they have independent jurisdiction in most cases to be able to bring their own suits. Okay, so we've gotten politics. I know. And again, we need like 2 follow-up discussions, Sarah. So let's note that. Okay. So we have gotten a couple of questions about libraries and the role of those who work in libraries and how libraries could maybe support these efforts to protect a local media and publishing landscape. Curious if anybody has thoughts there.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go, Victor.
Nope. All right, very quick, because I don't have a lot to say on it, but I will just say, first of all, librarians are awesome. And libraries are a radical institution. It's one of those things like probably could not be invented today. So thank God we have them. But I do think they can provide these kinds of public media spaces, these kind of already existing public infrastructures that we can leverage to try to create what I refer to in a very utopian way as this idea of establishing public media centers in every community across the country. And it's not going to be something that's going to happen anytime soon, certainly not during the Trump era, but we should be talking about these more utopian plans now, to have them in place, to be ready when those opportunities arise. And I do think libraries can serve as a kind of building block for this alternative public media system.
To give the dark side to Victor's hopeful statement about libraries, the private equity company that I mentioned earlier, KKR, which has its terrible fingers in so many different things in our lives, also owns, last I knew, Overdrive, which owns Libby, which has a monopoly over ebook lending in our public libraries. And so one thing that would be great, it would be to get a lot more people to understand that KKR, private equity, like private equity should have nothing to do with our public libraries. Our public libraries, including the ebook lending, should be like a public utility, you know? And so it would be like I have never heard anything to any effect that anyone's even knows about this at a large degree or is trying to fight against it. But has more and more of public libraries moved from physical collections to ebook lending, we would really do well to get private equity out of there.
It would also be amazing to just do some collective organizing of ways that we can recapture digital advertising revenue and streaming subscription revenue and have that go into places like libraries and individual organizations and independent journalists and independent filmmakers. It kind of replenished the funds that are very much going away. And I do feel like libraries are very much part of that because they are the OG civic institutions.
Great. And yeah, I'm glad that private equity has come up so much. I mean, one question here that I'll build off of and pivoting to the next one is, the role of independent journalists. What role do they play in this fight against corporate media control? I mean, I think independent journalists like, Jax, you shouted out Matt Stoller's newsletter, Big, have been covering things like private equity taking over the fire truck industry. And we are having more coverage now of private equity in youth sports and all of these things that seem like certainly private equity couldn't make a lot of money off of that, right? And it's like, answer, no, yes. Like the library lending system, I hadn't even heard about that one. But, these are the types of things, starting with even a Substack or, getting an article placed on some of these industries can lead to, like what we've seen this year, a bill introduced in Congress to ban private equity from investing in hospitals, for example. So it's step by step, but I do think, that I'm answering one of the questions. I'm taking moderator privileges here, but curious if anybody else on the panel has any other thoughts on that, the role of independent journalists in this fight.
I want to jump in on this. Independent journalism is incredibly important for covering a lot of stories that would otherwise go uncovered by mainstream media. I do want to say that we have major problems growing in our independent media space because a lot of it now is increasingly platform dependent on services like YouTube, like Substack, that are owned by incredibly large corporations that set the terms of how you can distribute, how you can monetize. I'll just say anecdotally, a lot of my friends who are doing creator media right now, they're kind of hitting a wall, trying to go after the subscription economy, and they're starting to run into the economic limits of what's possible within the current creator space. And then, we have a broader problem, which is that a lot of media consumption just in the public is now happening on a service like YouTube, which is also owned by Google. But, revenue sharing rates on a service like that are not quite generous enough that you're actually seeing these people who have great voices scaling actual media, small businesses on there. So you're seeing a ceiling on what independent media can do because of the platform conditions that are being created that people have to operate under. Because it's incredibly capital intensive to have these networks of distribution sometimes, even though stuff like email is free, distributing by podcast is technically free. But what we're seeing in the space is that it's a new type of media capture where you have independent voices, but you have incredibly dependent distribution and monetization. And it's really putting a limit on what we can do there.
Great. And I'll turn it to Jax, but I'm just going to build, because actually, Matt, you've kind of previewed a question that we had. Are you all hearing about tools being developed to help create more independent platforms to give independent makers more control? But yeah, Jax, I'll turn it to you, and if anybody has thoughts on that specifically as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that too, around digital advertising. I mean, companies like Google and Meta, they're capturing a dominant share of the digital advertising revenue. So even even when the ads are targeted at a specific zip code, the bulk of the economic value accrues to the platform and not to the local institutions or the independent people who are using those platforms. So I think the goal when I was mentioning, just to go back to digital advertising revenue, is finding ways to tax that. So that way it actually can reroute and recapture the money that has been extracted and going back in to that realm. And I did a blog post about this a few weeks ago, and I'll just post this in here because this would be something I would love to work with people who are passionate about this, like Matt and Dan and Victor, and find ways of seeing if we can test this out in smaller localities geographically.
Great. Dan?
Yeah, so I can, in this instance, point to one small good thing in the
Dan, we
world.
love the optimism, the moments of optimism. Yes.
Yeah, in the world of at least publishing as, an old technology for distribution and getting people's work out to folks. There was a really great development in October of last year. I will put a link in the chat where a woman named Jen Benka, who's a longtime kind of worker in nonprofit literary arts, organized 7 major philanthropic funds led by the Mellon Foundation to put together $50 million, which is a lot in the world of nonprofit publishing. It's the second biggest amount of money ever brought to nonprofit publishing in the United States to literary arts. For the Literary Arts Fund, it's a fund dedicated to all forms of the literary arts. So that includes fellowships and residencies and prizes and publishers. But part of what they're doing, it's a smart setup. It's not just 50 million to give to these literary arts nonprofits. They're also doing a lot of research and education for other philanthropists to really try to build an understanding because the literary arts and publishing is actually kind of hard to get people to wrap their heads around as something that works as a nonprofit because people just think it's like, well, you've got Grey Wolf Press or Milkweed Press or whatever. But what makes that different than Penguin Random House? Why do we need to like donate money to Milkweed? And people don't understand that that consolidation has pushed out these other companies, and in order for them to do the sort of interesting, daring, dangerous work that they publish, they need that kind of support. So the Literary Arts Fund is gathering all this research, top of the line research about how the money works, what the history of philanthropic funding for these areas are, in an attempt to get a lot more people with money. Not that, rich people giving us money to do what we want to do is the solution in the long run, but it's one way to help publishers get out the work that we want to be out there.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Victor?
Yeah, thanks. I also want to jump in on the on a little bit of the optimism there, and go back to this question around independent journalism. We're obviously living through arguably a new golden age for independent journalism, and I think it's something to be celebrated. And yet, I also agree with what Matt was saying that it's facing so many structural constraints right now. And even so for example, last week at the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College, they were handing out awards, Izzy Awards, to all the great independent journalism that's happening this last year. But we also need to find ways to economically support this kind of journalism. The optimism here is that we're seeing at the state level, which is often something we don't look at in terms of policy, that in many states across the country right now, they're funding things like civic information consortiums, and New Jersey is kind of the gold standard for this, the proof of concept. But we also have a bill here in Pennsylvania where the state legislature is seriously considering having this civic information consortium where it allocates millions of dollars to local journalistic initiatives. Interesting things are happening in California right now, Wisconsin, so many states are really looking at these kinds of bills where we can find ways to publicly support that kind of independent media that our democracy requires.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to do lightning round. Each panelist, if you could tell everyone watching to do one thing leaving this session, what would you do? I'm going to start with Matt because I know he can handle the pressure of going first. No, you all could, but I'm just going to start with Matt because he's on my right. And then I'll turn it over to Sarah to close us out. Matt?
Oh, unionize, but also like make big tech pay for all this stuff. Those are two things, but do them together.
Great. Dan.
Know who publishes the book you buy and look out for small publishers and try to buy their books.
Jax.
Go to blockthemerger.com, share your story, take a few actions, get involved, sign the open letter. There's lots of things there. And also in that link that I shared for the Shorenstein research I've been working on, there's also surveys for public engagement at the bottom of all of that, testing out some potential avenues for civic media trusts.
Great. And Victor, last but not least.
All right. Well, I would certainly say thank a journalist, thank them for their public service. See journalism as the essential service that it is for our democracy, but also support your local media, subscriptions, donations, and maybe get involved with the Media Power Collaborative. They're really focusing on journalism as a policy problem for all of us that we need to engage with. So lots of things we can do.
Awesome. Well, thank you again to all of our panelists. Virtual round of applause. I've learned a lot in this discussion. I'll also put a plug in for American Economic Liberties Project. We're part of the Block the Merger Coalition, but always curious about anybody facing a consolidation fight. We want to be a partner and support your cause. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I will turn it back to Sarah. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Morgan, doing an amazing job moderating this fantastic conversation. Just want to give a thanks to all of our volunteers here, the American Economic Liberties Project, Documentary Producers Alliance, the Coalition for Documentary Workers, Future Film Coalition, Media Power Collaborative, and Free Press Action, the News Guild, Communication Workers of America, Progressive Librarians Guild, Rebuild Local News, and the Writers Guild of America East. So again, the National Writers Union is a labor union recognized by the National Labor Relations Board. We represent freelancers and workers in all of these industries. So obviously the conversation we had here is extraordinarily impactful on the members of our union and also all of our communities and our partners. So we're really thrilled to host this. Hoping to continue conversations like this in the future. It's really essential for our democracy. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thanks for everyone who put time into this important event. I put some links in the chat to join the Freelance Solidarity Project in the National Writers Union, and we will send out follow-up resources about some of the links that our speakers shared and action items and a lot of just educational information about these topics. So thanks, everyone. Really glad to see you. Bye.